Well, hi, this is Dr. Stan and it's a privilege to be able to come to you through this video medium to talk about a very difficult topic, really, family violence. This teaching is a part of a curriculum that is developed by Vision International Education Services and Vision International University, and can be used for either a course in family violence and especially counseling people who are struggling with family violence, but it's also a part of our certification program for domestic violence counselors here in the San Diego County area. So what we're going to be covering is material that is to a great extent a part of my book that I've written called Patterns of Destruction: Counseling for Victims of Family Violence. And this book is, along with an additional book called Crisis Counseling, will be required as a part of the training necessary to become certified as a domestic violence counselor. And so I hope that you'll stick with the course. I'll try and make it as interesting as possible, even though, again, it's emotionally a difficult information to try and process, but I think you'll find it to be very helpful as you prepare yourself to be able to counsel and assist men and women, children that are struggling with the ramifications of domestic violence. So with that bit of introduction, let me just jump right into the lecture. Because every day, spouses, children, experience the loss of trust and security that comes because of domestic violence. Whether it be verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, financial abuse, all of these types of abuse affect people in very dramatic ways. Wives get battered by husbands, and husbands at times by wives. Parents can be attacked by teens. Children are abused. And often the abuse comes because of a dysfunctional family, dysfunctional marriage, often leading to divorce. Siblings, in fact, are known to abuse one another. These types of problems happen all the time within the culture in which we live, especially here in the United States. And there are certain cultural patterns that we have discovered that tend to lend themselves toward abusive behavior. Belief that certain cultures are more violent than others is just not necessarily true, but there does seem to be some culturally specific patterns that are more acceptable within certain cultures. We'll talk more about that as we go. Sometimes there can be philosophical or religious underpinnings that give tacit approval and or permission for certain types of violence. For instance, we know from a biblical viewpoint, the Bible does say, spare the rod and spoil the child. Therefore, many parents think that gives them the permission to beat their children. Well, the fact is the Hebrew culture, as we know, ancient culture, was a barbaric culture. We've certainly learned that there are much more effective ways to discipline children. And corporal punishment is rarely, if ever, necessary in dealing with a child. But nonetheless, many would believe that it's a parent's right to be able to discipline a child physically, even to a place of abuse, because the Bible says it's okay. Well, really, within the context of the scripture, what the writer in the book of Proverbs is simply saying is that, discipline is necessary for every child. And if you don't discipline a child in an effective way, well, naturally, they're going to end up being spoiled. Well, that's a reality. That's why people need to have healthy parenting. But beating a child, especially causing damage to them physically, emotionally, or otherwise, is never acceptable and never necessary. Then there's, generational. One of the things we know is that children that have been abused often becomes either further victims of abuse or end up being abusers themselves. We learn certain patterns of behavior, especially in times of stress, or when, as we'll look at later, lubricated by alcohol or drugs. We tend to lose healthy inhibitions, and we tend to act out in patterns that we've learned, especially within our family of origin. Well, there are actually multiple causes of domestic violence and family violence in general. Frequently, we know that victims, for instance, marry victimizers. Now, there's many reasons for that. But I think one of the most profound ones is that someone who has been victimized, has been abused, tends to see that as normal, quote unquote, within their world. And in some ways, the behavior having been perpetrated on them is seen as normal or even the way it's supposed to be. And thus, what can I expect as I grow into my maturity? Should I expect to be loved and respected and honored and cared for, or should I expect the same kind of treatment that I've received as a child? In many other ways, the victim becomes then a victimizer in order to try and gain their own power. And thus they make a determination, often early in life, I'll never allow that to happen to me. But thus, when, again, in circumstances of stress especially, the tendency to act out, to express the hurt, the pain, in an inappropriate way becomes a part of what many victims who become victimizers experience. There's also just the concept of impulse control. The fact is that to hurt someone usually is not done in a premeditated fashion, but it's done out of an impulse. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I feel that I've been rejected or abandoned or betrayed or abused. And I respond, but it's not really a response, it's more of an autonomic nervous system reaction, just impulse. Well, we know that, for instance, children by nature are impulsive. They do not have the ability to govern their emotions in an effective way. But we assume that as a person grows older, they will learn to manage their emotional reactions to situations. But some really never do. And impulse control is even more difficult when you fuel it with things like alcohol and or drugs. And so impulse control is very important. So along with maybe having experienced victimization growing up, one's impulse control and the ability to respond rather than react is a very important component of what can cause domestic violence. Then typically there's a trigger. Something happens. Something is said, a way it's said, triggers a person's reaction or angry response. I mean, I remember watching my own parents, who have long since passed away. It was a typical dance that oftentimes led to a great deal of verbal abuse, sometimes even physical. And as children growing up, my sister, my brother, and I would have to listen to that because we were in the house. In fact, I remember probably the only time we were invited into my sister's bedroom was during times that my mom and dad were going at each other, speaking Navy fluently, and threatening each other, threatening divorce, etc. And a similar kind of a typical scenario was my dad would come home from work, and typically in his day he was overworked and underpaid. He started in the Navy. He wanted to be a Navyman his whole life, but my mom didn't want anything to do with the military life, and so he kind of bounced from job to job to job, always trying to do his best. But it was typical of a Friday afternoon. My dad would get home from work, and he would hand my mom his piddly little paycheck, kind of sheepishly. It was the best he could do. He was trying real hard, and he was hoping to receive some sort of approval from my mom. My mom was not a mean or wicked woman, but she was wounded as well. She had been abused as a child. My dad had been abused as a child. How they found each other, I mean, it's almost impossible to tell. But anyway, they did, and they were married, and they had children, and they wanted to have a good family life, but they just weren't very mature. And so my mom would react with a kind of a patented sigh, and make a statement to my dad, something like, well, I guess I'll try and do the best I can to take care of our children with as little money as you give me. And my dad would kind of, cough at that, and, well, I'm doing the best I can. Well, I know, but it's not enough, and it's never enough, and you've never provided enough. And they were off to the races, yelling, screaming. The trigger for my dad was typically a sense of being rejected. For my mom, it was the fear that she was going to be abandoned. They had issues, as most couples do that end up being involved in domestic violence. They would end up yelling and screaming. There's more than once that, my mom would even pull a knife. She wouldn't threaten my dad with it. She'd put it toward her own heart and threaten herself. And, my sister, my brother, and I, we saw these things. We were raised in that kind of environment. It was very painful, very difficult. And, oftentimes we don't think about the kids that are observing these things, who are being affected by this dysfunctional life pattern. So one of the things that we find is, yes, there is certainly some history of abuse, neglect within the family. And there is often impulse control, and both my dad and my mom, they suffered with impulse control issues. But then something triggers. It doesn't always lead to abuse in terms of physical, but often verbal, and sometimes neglect, etc., will happen because of it. And then ultimately what's triggered is rage. Now, rage is really, truly, it's out of control anger. Now, everybody gets angry. We know that. Anger is caused by frustration. Anger is caused by being hurt. But this kind of anger is pent up. It's a reservoir of anger based upon a belief that someone has been mistreated and deserves revenge. And this rage that comes out is often very much out of control and can be extremely destructive. So what we look at in terms of husbands and wives and relationships and domestic violence is that women have been taught historically to repress their sexuality, to repress their anger, to repress their assertiveness. Now, much of that is changing within our culture, some of that to the good. Men tend to repress their dependency, their emotionalism, their vulnerability, their passivity or absence of sexuality. And they repress fear because it's not okay for a man to be any of those things. And so commonly what we find in domestic violence is more stereotypical relationships where you have a more feminine focused female and a more masculine, quote unquote, focused male according to those family traditions. So family dynamics then are key to helping people begin the process of unraveling the dynamics that cause the violence within the family. And so when you're dealing with families, and of course, whether you're functioning as a domestic violence counselor, as a volunteer, or if you're a trained professional therapist, you know how volatile family violence issues can be. Most police officers, the last thing they want to hear is a domestic violence call because they can be so disruptive, so crazy, and so volatile. But sadly, it's a big problem. It's a problem in the society at large. It's a problem within the church. It's a problem within Boy Scouts. It's a problem within every type, again, of church life. And unfortunately, the solutions are not easy, but solutions must be found. And one of the reasons why we're training and equipping men and women to be able to function as domestic violence counselors is so that they can help in the process of healing and restoration, which is possible. I know a lot of people think that once you've gone down that road of violence or abuse, you can never go back, but that is not true. There are thousands of men and women who have even been an abuser and or abused and have gone through the hard work of recovery and are functioning well in happy and healthy relationships today. So the work is not in vain, but the work is hard. It's not easy. There are different stages of abuse. We look at 4 primary stages. The first is that of the buildup. You know, as I was using my parents as an example, and they don't mind, they're happy in heaven, and you know, we've talked about all these things when they were still here. It starts with often little things, little arguments, but most of their arguments were related to money. And that is, by the way, the number one stressor in marriages. It's not communication, it's not sexuality, it's money. And it's usually not necessarily the lack of money, but it's often the mismanagement of money that causes the incredible amount of stress in relationships. The build-up phase can last for weeks, months, even years before someone actually acts out in a violent act. They often will have struggles in terms of their thinking about their partner. I mean, initially, most couples, when they, fall in love or fall in lust, anyway, when they find each other, things usually go relatively well because their focus is on how good they look in their partner's eyes. I mean, love is deaf, dumb, blind, and often stupid, especially romantic love. And so in that early phase of romantic bliss, often the issues or problems or difficulties within the relationship are not seen, or they're glanced over. Forgiveness is quick because they want to get back to the love potion that they're experiencing. But after a season, the romance and the newness of a relationship may begin to wane, and they begin to see each other more objectively. And they begin to see the flaws and the things that used to be so endearing. I heard men say, when we first met, I just loved to listen to her talk. She was always so sweet. She would just go on and on about things. It was the most endearing, most adoring thing I've ever experienced. Now I can't wait to see, when is she gonna shut up? She's driving me nuts. And you find, he was such a great listener, but now he never talks. Now those are somewhat common and relatively normal issues within a normal marriage. But within someone who has been abused or neglected or has been are emotionally blunted or immature, these little things can be exacerbated and become big things. And so over a period of time, there's this buildup of frustration, of hurt, of anger, which eventually leads to then an episode or an explosion. And most, especially in physical domestic violence, you'll find that the perpetrator, and most of the time it's a male, will say, it just suddenly happened. I don't know what came over me. I just lost it. I didn't mean to hurt her. I'll never do it again. I do so solemnly swear. And that is how they experience it. They're not lying when they say that. They're just not clear about the truth. That there has been a long build-up period before the episode. And again, it could be a push, it could be a shove, it could be a slap, it could be threats, it could be other activities that limit the spouse's ability to live in freedom and harmony. So whatever those things are, those behaviors, they're obviously problematic, and there has to come a time when the first episode occurs. Well, typically after that first episode, there is a honeymoon period. And, here's one of the seductive things, especially about domestic violence between husbands and wives or partners, is that they experience then the honeymoon as the best thing that's ever happened to them. I mean, it's better than the first honeymoon, and for many reasons. I mean, the perpetrator, again, normally a husband or a domestic partner, will say, I love you, I need you. They buy flowers, they take them to restaurants. They become like, in the fantasy often of the woman, the Prince Charming that she always knew she had actually married or was in relationship with. Well, of course, he's not a Prince Charming, he's just a guy, but he's acting this way because of the fear of loss. And there is a huge fear that my behavior may have been so destructive that I'm going to lose the object of my attention and my need. And so they become just wonderful, caring, generous, kind, loving. I mean, they're the best version of themselves they've ever been. And it's quite seductive. I mean, perhaps in the beginning, the spouse, the wife, is strong and says, you hurt me, I'm not ready to be close to you, etc. But over time, her resistance to his charm, if you will, his love, his attention, begins to wear down because there's a part of her that desperately wants, desperately needs to know that she's loved and wanted and desired, and this is just wonderful. And they come back together and they begin to live out their life again. But what happens, of course, is there's a recycle. And typically the recycle happens in a shorter period of time. In other words, they go back to being the way they were, just as immature as they were before, just as impulsive, just as wounded and hurt as previous. So the buildup, which may have taken weeks, months, or even years before the first episode, now becomes, if it was years, it's now months. And months becomes weeks, and many times weeks become days. And the level of violence tends to increase because it becomes easier and easier to express my anger in an inappropriate way because my partner keeps coming back for more. And so what you find is, especially after the major episode, you find promises. And again, the promises are sincere. I sincerely believe I'll never do this again. I know I would never hurt you. I'll never neglect you, abandon, betray, or abuse you ever again. I've learned my lesson. I do so solemnly swear or affirm. The promises, of course, are weak because promises are easy to make, but they're not always easy to keep. And so often what we find is that the promises are simply designed to make sure I don't experience loss. What is it I have to do? What is it I have to be in order for you not to leave me or not to punish me? And so if you're involved in the counseling process, you have to recognize the deep sincerity, which is not deep because it's very surface. It's not based upon the reality of something they can keep. So you have to listen to the promises, but you also have to recognize how shallow most of those promises are. You have to always concern yourself with safety over tradition or over what the desires of the couple are. You'll often find that it's not the husband that's so desperate to get back together, it's the wife that wants to patch up this problem, this disaster that's waiting to happen. And so you have to make sure that there's issues of safety taken care of, especially for the one who has been battered or abused, more than you care about the tradition of making sure that they're together at all cost. Again, in our culture, oftentimes divorce is just too easy. But sometimes divorce, or at least separation, is necessary in order to give room for healing to be able to occur. And so if you're involved in the counseling process, you want to be very careful to make sure that safety's in place first. And you're going to hear more about that in sessions taught by Danny Womack. So I think you're going to really enjoy that part as well, the safety plan. It's very, very important. Now, often we find that a multidisciplinary approach is really needed. That is, it's not just, sometimes we need the police. We need the hammer to be laid down upon somebody and to let them know that this kind of behavior is not only unacceptable, but it's going to land you in jail. In fact, in most cases, when domestic violence is reported, they're going to jail, even if it's for just a night or two. And then there's going to be adjudication of that case following up from there. Many times we, as counselors, we get called into the middle of that to try not to keep the person out of jail. Sometimes that jail experience is the smack in the head that they needed to realize that what they're doing was very inappropriate and could lead to all kinds of other problems. But ultimately, jail is really not the best place for someone involved in domestic violence unless, again, as we'll look at child abuse later, if they're a predator, well, perhaps jail is the only thing, prison is the only thing that's going to keep the world safe from them and them from themselves. But the multidisciplinary approach can include chaplains or pastors. It can include counselors or therapists, social workers, child protective services. But whatever it is, the goal, again, is not necessarily the preservation of the relationship. The goal is to bring safety and to provide what's necessary for people to address the underlying issues that got them to where they are, and hopefully help them to move beyond that into healthy, positive relationships. Well, abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse, it's destructive, of course. It's extremely painful to everybody involved. And often what you'll find, and especially as you listen to the stories of people, there are certain symptoms that seem to be a part of people who have experienced abuse. And there's in many ways similar to PTSD symptoms. We'll talk more about that. In children, one of the things that you'll often observe is that a child who is withdrawn from healthy social encounters. Now again, there's a time in a young child's life when it's natural for them to have stranger anxiety. But when you've got an 8, 9, 10-year-old that can't express even general courtesies in relationship, sometimes it means there's something there. Now, one of the things to always be aware of is just because you see a certain symptom, it doesn't automatically mean that someone is being abused or is an abuser. It's just one piece of information. Now, it could be an important piece, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to document. And again, we'll talk more about that. But the key thing is it's primarily one piece of information. When you have children that have nightmares or fears of undressing, fears of being left alone, severe anger, violent play, self-punishing behavior, or sometimes you'll see a pseudo-maturity, a child that they're not a child at all. They act always like adults, only want to hang around with adults. Again, it's not normal, if you will, behavior for that. It's normal for kids to be around kids. And so these are potential symptoms that you look for when you're dealing with a child that may be involved in some sort of abuse. Even the abuse of observing or being around parental domestic violence. For females, as they become adolescents and into adulthood, we often see, memory blocks, and secrecy is a big part of the way their life is, the way they see themselves. They also may experience nightmares, insomnia, or they can become extremely seductive or promiscuous as a reaction to, or a way to try and actually repair the damage that's been done because of sexual abuse or physical abuse. Often we'll see panic attacks or depression and anxiety in general that can be a part of someone who has been abused. Again, these are also symptoms of people that just haven't been abused but have other issues that have to be looked at. So again, you don't want to make a judgment immediately that, aha, I know this person's been abused, because a lot of mistakes have been made. A lot of people have been hurt because of that immediate assumption and then acting on that assumption to call the police, etc. So you want to make sure that what you're seeing is really what's there, that someone truly has been neglected or abused. Eating disorders and, of course, repeated abuse patterns often are indicators of a female that has been abused in the past. For males, the symptoms are similar, but sometimes more pervasive. For instance, there again, depression and anxiety, but often there's self-hatred. Suicidal ideation, stomach disorders, identity confusion, difficulty in developing intimate relationships are often some of the results of having been abused. I mean, for men especially, sexual abuse, if it's been perpetrated on them by a male, often creates an identity confusion. You know, did I want it? Did I ask for it? Does it mean that I'm homosexual? It causes great confusion for them, as it does for women. What does this mean? That am I only good for being abused, being taken advantage of? Was I ever loved? Were all of those words of endearment that I heard, is any of it real? And it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety, depression, and identity-related conflict. So there's additional indicators of, if you will, maltreatment in relationships in general. And we often see these in now couples that have found each other and are now involved in maybe a second or third generation of domestic violence. Number one is a lack of trust. I mean, having a healthy relationship requires the ability to trust your spouse, to trust them with your thoughts, to trust them with your expressions, your emotions, to trust them with your words, to trust you that your intentions are good. But in many, especially relationships that end up in domestic violence, there is a significant lack of trust. And there's thus suspicion or jealousy that's often manifested in the relationship. Again, when that jealousy gets out of hand, it can lead toward a response of domestic violence. Secondly is a low self-esteem. I mean, most people that have been abused don't suddenly feel great about their life. They suffer, and the suffering is real. Because, and it's a typical thought of children growing up, is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. In other words, they see the world very black and white, and if a bad thing has happened, it's not because the person that did it to me was bad, but it must mean that I'm bad.